We invite you to listen to the discussions recorded during the Warsaw European Conversation, an annual conference by Polityka Insight and the European Council on Foreign Relations. In 5 episodes, we discuss Europe's readiness for war, digital sovereignty, the competitiveness of the EU economies, European elections, and energy policy. In today's episode, we discuss the future of transatlantic relations and the evolution of security policy on both sides of the Atlantic. We examine France's strategic stance and the implications of potential leadership change. We also look at the dynamics of US domestic politics, the role of political parties and civil society in curbing Donald Trump's power, and the significance of the midterm elections. We consider what these processes mean for Europe, especially in the context of Article 5. Joining Marta Prochwicz-Jazowska, Deputy Head of the ECFR Warsaw office in the discussion, will be Thomas Gomart, Director of the French Institute of International Relations, and Amanda Sloat, Professor at the School of Politics, Economics and Global Affairs at IE University. Enjoy the episode.
Thomas Gomart, welcome. You run ECFR, one of Europe's leading think tanks. You're a historian of international relations, one of France's top voices on geopolitics and French foreign policy and European policy. You recently published a book, Who Controls Who? There's no shortage of things to discuss. We have a war raging in the Middle East, a war just next door from where we sit right now, Warsaw, the war in Ukraine, which has been going on for a long time, and the French president who just announced the biggest shift in nuclear doctrine in 30 years in France. Let's get straight into it. First, I wanted to look at the example of Iran, but broaden it a little bit. So the European reaction to the American and Israeli attack on Iran has remarkably shifted over the last couple of weeks. First of all, it's gone through several stages. The first reaction was to try to not contradict Washington. But then when the President of the United States demanded European or allied help with the Strait of Hormuz, there was initial unwillingness to go in, and European countries set their own conditions. So it seems that Europe is saying that it is not ready to fight a war that it did not start, a war of choice by the Americans and the Israelis. Could we say that Europe has actually learned to say no to the American administration? It has also threatened the use of the ACI instrument previously in the conflict, in the situation over Greenland. From where I sit in Warsaw, on NATO's eastern flank, we remain fundamentally dependent on the United States, its security capabilities, the US troops on the ground, the 10,000 troops that serve as a tripwire force in our deterrence against Russia. Have we forgotten that there are repercussions in terms of what the United States could do to European security and these tripwire forces and the other capabilities that they provide? And are we not going a little bit too far in our response?
Good afternoon, Marta, and thank you very much for your invitation and for these very difficult questions, because there are different dimensions. The very first one, which should be underlined according to me, is to try to get a geostrategic perspective about what is happening and to understand that there are some interaction between the Ukrainian theater, the Middle East theater, and possibly also the China Sea theater. And I think that we should try to understand properly this interaction. The basic difference, it is the fact that in 2014, so already 12 years ago, Russia attacked Ukraine. And the second important reminder is that Iran was attacked by Israel and the United States. And I think that it's very important for Europeans to remember that Israel was successful last June to attract President Trump to the first strike against Iran. If you remember the first Trump's mandate, he was very reluctant to intervene. He refused to order a military operation against Iran, but he was ready to order the killing of General Soleimani in Iraq. It was, in fact, his main decision regarding what at that time. Now the situation is completely different, and to some extent, Prime Minister Netanyahu was successful in attracting President Trump on his not only political line in terms of interpreting what is happening, but also in terms of military lines. So the second point of observation, it is obviously the consequences for Europeans. The problem is that nobody, of course, in Europe was happy with the regime, with the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. There was different attacks against some European countries by Iran, by the Islamic Republic of Iran, against France, for instance, and no doubt about that. And also the fact that there is massive demonstration against the regime, in Iran is also a very important point. But the thing is, it's completely against the international law. And indeed, these strikes made by Israel and the US. And it was said by Europeans, but at the same time, as you said, also by very careful for understandable reasons, but very reluctant to blame directly, the US administration for doing so. The third point of observation, it is the fact that there is a lot of naivete, between Europeans and Americans about what is happening in the Middle East, because the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is a global choke point, and that's this idea coming from the US administration that there will be no Iranian reaction to the bombing, this is just a stupid idea, to be honest. So, of course, Iran reacted against the Gulf countries, which are linked to some European countries, and for instance, France, by some defense agreements. So in a sense, we are also in this position where it's very important for some European countries, the UK also, to respect the agreement we have made with some Gulf countries. Consequences for the direct transatlantic relation, I think that's okay. Europeans said no, but they said no for Greenland. And I think that now it's more and more clear that we are in a situation of, I would say, ideological divergence between Europe and the US, even if there are still some political forces, but less vocal than 1 year ago, to support Trump.
But what if Donald Trump keeps on pushing and demands or associates, which he already has? He's called us bad allies. Of course, the Europeans are shouldering the burden of supporting Ukraine. We've taken on that support almost entirely. Nevertheless, having especially American boots on the ground here from the eastern flank perspective definitely provides that idea of deterrence. We're not 100% sure how much is behind it and how credible it actually is, but nevertheless, it creates ambiguity in the mind of our greatest enemy, Putin. So there's a certain threshold at which we would be reluctant to say no constantly to the United States.
First of all, I think we should accept the ideological convergence or collusion between the White House and the Kremlin since last January. One of the most important events was the Anchorage summit, last summer, and the fact that President Trump welcomed in Alaska President Putin. So, in terms of orientation, its counter-narrative, on Ukraine is something pivotal, regarding the Trump administration fundamental orientation. I wouldn't say the same for the whole US system, of course, but for the Trump administration, it is very clear. And also we observe in pure diplomatic terms, that what is decided by President Trump is supposed to be implemented only by two of his fellows, Serge Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who are supposed to deal with Ukraine and also to deal with Iran. So the very first point for Europeans is just to take very seriously into consideration this messy situation and maybe not to be all the time completely obsessed and focused by the US, because we should remind that in 2003, when the US and the UK decided to bomb Iraq, some European countries followed them, but some others was against that. Berlin, Paris, and at that time, very important to remind, Moscow. I think that, the consequences of this war in Iraq after, the intervention of Afghanistan appear very clear in retrospect. So, okay, it will be difficult. We should continue to deal with our main ally, especially when you are indeed located in Poland or in Baltic states or everywhere. But at the same time, we know that it will be more and more very tricky relations. A lot of political, diplomatic, military resources should be allocated to try to manage that properly.
And to counterbalance, of course, this dependence, agreed on that. Let's turn to Ukraine. We already mentioned it a little bit. As we said, Europe has assumed the bulk of the aid, yet it's being kept out of the negotiations between the US and Russia and Ukraine. Of course, our financial space continues to shrink, and that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the situation in France is such as well with its budget crisis. Energy prices are surging. Sanctions on Russian oil, American sanctions, have been temporarily lifted. There's a scarcity of capabilities decreasing, and populism is rising in Poland all the way to France. After a potential ceasefire, of course, we have no idea when this could actually happen, but there is increasing pressure from the side of the United States, most particularly when there is no success in the Middle East. It might increase the pressure to actually have a ceasefire in Ukraine. That's just a hypothetical. What should France, after the ceasefire is implemented, do to help Ukraine survive this moment?
Of course, it's not only a question for France, even if it's an important one. Before trying to respond directly for France, one of the main strategic surprises for the last couple of months was the degree of Ukrainian resistance, which was unexpected to some extent. This ability of Ukraine, despite the US attitude, to continue to fight. And that leads to two very important conclusions for the future of Europe. Ukraine is building a strong military industry with some capabilities very important on which other European countries are not experienced, namely drones and the fight against drones. And also, Ukraine now proposes its knowledge to some Middle East countries and also interact with the US regarding the situation in Iran because of its military experience. So it's just a way to illustrate, this interaction between theaters I have previously mentioned. The other important thing was the attempts, which was a diplomatic initiative coming from London and Paris for coalition of the willing for Ukraine with different approaches. But at the end of the day, you have more and more this idea in Europe that, of course, they do not want the US would leave from European security for all the reasons already set. But you have more and more this idea that certainly they will have in the future to deal more and more by themselves the Russian issue. We made at E3 11 other European think tanks a net assessment of the relation between Europe and Russia up to 2030. And the conclusion is Europe can manage, this confrontation which has been decided by Russia if, and it's a very big if, it has the political will to do so. So that leads to your question for France and other countries, which is also the ability of Russia to influence Europe, globally speaking, of course, by a war in Ukraine, the level of losses and so on, plus the fact that some political forces, in fact, refer, not all the time openly, but refer to Trump and Putin to some extent. And we have that with the wording populism, which is covering different realities. But to some extent, it is quite clear that the MAGA sphere and the Kremlin sphere, through social media to some extent, share the same objective, which is to deadlock Europe strategically. It's very important, I think, once again, to mention this game changer, which is the ideological collusion between the MAGA sphere and Russia.
And against those odds and in that difficult situation and against the budgetary problems, how will, and I'm sorry to very specifically drill you on France, but that's my role here in this podcast, how will France be able to continue to support Ukraine through the coalition of the willing is one, but there's sustaining basically the sanctions on Russia. That's one important aspect of continuing to deter Russia from attacking the eastern flank or re-attacking Ukraine, and to continue to provide arms.
3 points. The first one is, okay, you have the military spending. That's one thing. And you're right to remind that the budgetary situation for France is not an easy one. Having said that, you can have higher military budgets than the French one and be unable to use your navy. Have a look about the situation for the UK, for instance. Whose country, sent support to Cyprus after having been attacked by Iran? That's the French navy. Okay? So just to say that military spending is one thing, but also military capability and wish to use them is another one. And on that, it's very, very easy, to criticize France when you are in Europe for its budgetary deficit, but it's also a way to remind that we have many defaults in France, but we never accept the idea that we should not invest on our defense and security, which is a big difference with some of our main partners. So that's point number one. Point number two, you're right, the level is certainly not sufficient regarding the demand for coming from Ukraine, but in terms of political initiative, political leadership, to some extent, coalition of the willing was a way just to remind that Europeans should be at the table negotiation. And I mentioned previously, the Anchorage summit, remind that just after, it was not easy, but European leaders, some of them, came to Washington with President Zelensky just to say, it's an issue for European security, that means that Europeans should be involved. Is it successful? Certainly not enough, but it was made. And last but not least, President Macron, made a very important statement 2 of March in Lyon about nuclear deterrence. Why? Because he said 3 very important things. First of all, now the number of nuke will no more be communicated. It will increase not massively, but significantly. Second, you have this notion which is not so easy to be translated into English. In French, it's épaulement, this idea that we should find between Europeans much more precisely in terms of escalation, of possible escalation, between conventional forces and nuclear forces. And last but not least, and it was prepared by a very ambitious strategic maneuver, it was to announce that 8 European countries do want to have a nuclear strategic dialogue with France. For the UK, that's something very narrow since many decades. But the fact that Germany, Poland, Sweden, Greece, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands accepted to be quoted is certainly reflecting a new step.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, it's not critique, it's concern. And because it concerns us all. And I'll just add one other thing to your list is the 2025 National Strategic Review that France undertook, and you were certainly consulted on, which specifically said that there is a particularly high risk of major high-intensity war in Europe by 2030. And that is a major shift for France, which in its previous strategic review in 2017 named terrorism as one of the main concerns. The word was mentioned over 100 times. So from our perspective on the eastern flank, we're seeing this shift. And my last question is probably of greatest concern, which is the 2027 election, which we already mentioned a little bit. So leading in the polls is Jordan Bardella. What would Bardella presidency mean for the role of France in Europe, for the support of Ukraine? Just those two.
It's interesting what you referred to the Strategic Review 2017 and the new one. I was involved in the writing of the 2017 edition. There was the public version, and Russia was already very high. There was not only terrorism, just to make things clear, but you're right for the most recent one. What is important is the fact that it is very clear in the strategic community. But when you say that, point number 7 you have mentioned, this perspective of major engagement, it is very difficult for the corporate world, not only in France, but everywhere in Europe, to have this sort of anticipation. Now, your question regarding Bardella, frankly speaking, I would prefer to be back, in next year to make this podcast, because this political situation in France is so unclear that Bardella is not yet in l'Élysée, Jean-Luc Mélenchon is not yet in l'Élysée. Maybe they will be elected, but there are over many options. So I think we should be careful. And just to give you some element of appreciation, to some extent, Bardella, by comparison with Le Pen, was more careful in his expression regarding Russia and Ukraine, by comparison with Mélenchon, which to some extent took it's a paradox, but took the Trump's argument about the fact that Ukraine was responsible for this war. It was not said in this way by Bardella.
Thank you very much, Thomas Gomart. Thank you very much for joining us on this podcast.
Thank you very much.
Amanda Sloat, welcome. You ran the Europe portfolio on Biden's National Security Council, and you spent years shaping U.S. policy towards Europe from inside the White House and the State Department. Currently, you work as a professor at IE University, and now you're watching things unfold, unravel from the outside as the U.S. fights a very unpopular war in Iran. President Trump does not manage to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, topples regimes in Venezuela, imposes tariffs across the globe. His approval ratings are actually quite low. The tariffs have driven up prices in the United States. Venezuela intervention does not seem to have solved things in Venezuela either. And he is falling short of expectations. And on Iran specifically, President Trump's own counterterrorism chief, who was a MAGA loyalist, resigned over the war in Iran. Nevertheless, and this is what we're seeing from Europe, it doesn't seem like Americans are going to the streets. And we're asking ourselves, why aren't Republicans saying no to Donald Trump? And why aren't Democrats more prominent? If you could help us to understand that a little bit better.
Well, thank you for having me. And I have to say it is a daunting list of challenges that's facing the United States, both on the domestic side and on the foreign policy side. And as you said, having spent my entire career focusing on transatlantic relations, I'm not only saddened by what's happening to the United States in terms of its own democracy, but I'm also very sad about the impact that it's having on the transatlantic relationship. In terms of what's happening domestically, you have Republicans within Congress that really seem to have gotten co-opted by Trump's control of the MAGA party. And I think you are seeing a number of Republicans privately expressing concern about what is Trump doing, privately expressing concern to the White House, but unfortunately have consistently been absolving themselves of their congressional duty to exercise proper oversight over the administration. You saw this with the decision not to move forward with legislation on tariffs, and you have seen this recently with them twice voting down measures that would exercise some sort of congressional constraint on what the administration is doing with its war aims. And I think there's a number of explanations for that. Some of them may be supportive of Trump's agenda. Some of them might be supportive of parts of his agenda. There is a tendency, as of course you have with parliamentary systems in Europe, to support the leader of your party and to support what they are doing, and perhaps hold your nose at some of the things you don't like in the name of getting through things that you do like. But I also think there's a real climate of fear, and we have seen members not only be afraid of facing primary challenges that Trump would support to run against them, but we have also seen instances where Trump has criticized publicly on social media Republican members that he thinks are disloyal to him, either not by supporting nominees or by not supporting legislation. And they get violently attacked on social media, and I think a number of them have gotten death threats as well. So you do have a climate of fear, not only politically, but in some cases in much more extreme ways. Now, if you turn to the Democrats, it is simply a reality of the American political system that the party in the minority in Congress simply has less power to do things. And so it's not that the Democrats are failing to exercise power that they have. They are fairly constrained by the nature of the system from doing things. They are certainly continuing to put forward pieces of legislation. They are being very public in terms of their criticism. They are trying to provide reassurance to our allies. You had a large number of them, for example, at the Munich Security Conference. You had senators, you had House members, you had governors, you had mayors trying to put forward a different message, saying that the Trump administration does not reflect all of America. And our system is different from the European parliamentary systems in that we do not have a singular opposition. So there is not one leader of the opposition that we can rally behind. And I don't think until we get past the midterms this November that there is going to start to be clarity among the candidates who will be vying to run in the 2028 presidential system. Historically, that is something that happens once we get past the midterms. Your final question on the public is one that Europeans ask me a lot. And One, I think we do not have the same culture in the United States as certainly the French have of taking to the streets very quickly when there are small things that the government does that they object to. We have had Americans on the streets, for example, with things like the civil rights movement, the Million Man March. So there is some culture of American activism, but it is not necessarily as common or as consistent as you have in places like France or in Belgium. We have had Americans on the street. There was a No Tyrants protest in October where you had over 5 million Americans on the street. There is another one happening in March where we again expect to see large numbers of Americans out on the street. You had Americans very active in Minneapolis, for example, documenting the abuses of power by ICE agents. And I think the recordings that American citizens did to protect those who were being aggressively and in many cases unlawfully detained and deported in many cases by ICE contributed to ICE eventually leaving Minneapolis. That was the direct result of activism there. You also have people exploring other types of activism, including through corporate measures. There was a very significant boycott of Tesla early in the administration, which contributed to Tesla stock falling and Elon Musk leaving the government and returning to his company. When Jimmy Kimmel was taken off the air for comments that were deemed unacceptable, you had a large number of Americans spontaneously canceling their Disney subscriptions, and that corporate pressure ended up leading to Jimmy Kimmel being reinstated. So I think there are a number of different ways in which Americans are protesting and organizing, including some of those ways that are not visible or as common as what you would necessarily see in Europe in protest.
It's certainly also the stock markets that when it comes to what actually affects changes with Donald Trump, it seems that the effect that his policies have on stock markets tend to be visible to him and cause him to pause. Is that a correct characterization?
I think that is absolutely the case. And you've seen that consistently. After the global tariffs were announced, you had a negative market reaction that led to some changes there. Greenland, the markets did not react well to that. And a lot of the ups and downs of the current approach to Iran also seem to be driven by the market.
At the conference where we are, at Warsaw European Conversation, there was actually one of the panels who used the term, said that what we're seeing in the United States is actually fascism. What would be your reaction to that?
You know, I will defer to scholars of history and political science in terms of the exact terminology, but I do think we are seeing a worrying drift towards authoritarian tendencies. We are definitely seeing democratic regression in a number of areas, and there have in fact been studies out, including by VDEM in the last couple of weeks, that track the very significant drop that the United States has had in democratic practices. We are seeing it in terms of treatment of journalists. We are seeing it with separation of powers. We're seeing it in the judiciary. We're seeing it in limitations on people's freedom of speech. And so, irrespective of what label you put on it, there is absolutely a very worrying decline of democratic principles in the U.S. People are also very concerned about whether elections in November are going to be free and fair. And there's a lot of concern about manipulation, including through legislation that the president is very keen to get through Congress with the SAVE Act, restrictions on people's right to vote, on voter identification, on the potential of deploying ICE or National Guard agents to polling stations, on the treatment of mail-in ballots. And that's also extremely concerning.
Before we turn to the midterms, just on democratic backsliding, you called it democratic regression. Democratic backsliding is something that the situation in Poland under the Law and Justice government, a term that was widely used because the effect of that specific government and its reforms in the judicial system in particular had this effect on Poland. And that's not something that you come back from easily. The current government under Donald Tusk is trying to reverse a lot of those reforms. It's successful in some, less successful in others. So do you think that the repercussions of the Donald Trump presidency for domestic politics in the United States in terms of this democratic regression, is that something that's going to be a problem for a long time to come? Or rather, is it really specific to this particular person? Because, and I mean Donald Trump, because you said that a lot of Republicans aren't being more vocal. There were death threats. They're being ashamed on social media. So these are things that are going to go away. So what's going to stay and what's going to go away?
I should say that there is a lot that the United States could learn from the experience of countries like Poland, the former Czechoslovakia, the democracy movements that your countries experienced. And I have to say it is much more humbling for me now to think about history given what I am witnessing in the United States. It's very easy to look at these historical movements and think in very abstract terms about what citizens were doing. But when I think about this now, the reality of large numbers of Americans going to the streets, potentially losing their lives on the streets in furtherance of democracy and freedom, it's very humbling, and I think there's a lot that the United States should be learning. I used to work for the National Democratic Institute, where we operated in different countries around the world, and we told them how to use their best democratic practices. And we now need to take those lessons home to ourselves, and I think we should be inviting Poles and others to the United States to advise us on this.
It's pretty ironic, because for many years, the United States, through USAID, supported civil society in Eastern Europe, which was a great movement, but it's kind of ironic that it wasn't, done the other way around somehow, or the common lessons learned and this building of civil society culture and of protest also.
Absolutely. So all of you are welcome to come to the United States. And I know those conversations are already happening, actually, with democracy activists and in the United States and elsewhere. On your specific question, again, you would have a better sense historically, but I do think once you start to have the erosion of democratic norms and practices, it is very difficult to come back with that. Trump, for example, in his first term, started talking about fake news and stolen elections. Fake news is now a very common part of our political vernacular, and it is also being adopted by political leaders in other countries. And once you start to raise doubts about the integrity of an election system, once you start to erode the powers of courts and of the Congress, it is difficult to get that back. I don't think it's entirely impossible. When I was in the Biden administration, I would argue that there had been an erosion in the first Trump administration of an inclusive interagency policymaking process. There was an erosion in the types of communications that the White House was putting out about calls the presidents had, about engagements and policies that it was making towards foreign countries. Some of those institutional things were quite easy for us to stand back up again, and I believe the next administration would do the same thing. We now have an incredibly polarized country, and we have an erosion of civility in politics, a trust in the political process, and that stuff is going to be much harder to try and reverse. So I think some of that is possible on the institutional side. We are seeing that the court system, while it may be slow, is still holding. For example, the Supreme Court pushed back on tariffs. We have seen lower courts pushing back on other areas of overreach, but it's slow and a lot of damage is being done in the meantime.
So coming back to the midterms, you mentioned, and there's been a little bit of talk of this, that first of all, the level playing field is not there, but will they actually take place?
I do believe there will be elections. Trump joked when he was sitting with President Zelensky in the Oval Office a year ago, I believe that was, about the idea that Ukraine was not able to have elections because of martial law. That idea seemed to be quite appealing to Trump. I do not believe he would be able to get away with not having elections. And I don't think the United States fighting a war in Iran constitutes a reason for not having elections. It's obviously a very different situation in Ukraine, where part of your country is occupied and a large number of your men are involved in fighting. A large number of your citizens are outside of the country. You can also look at the example of of 9/11, which happened in September. You had elections several weeks after that. Mayor Rudy Giuliani at the time talked about the possibility of delaying elections because of the tragedy that had affected the city and the destruction in the city. And there was incredible pushback on that idea. And that was in a city that had been severely damaged by the terrorist attack there. So it is hard for me to imagine the circumstances culturally, even on the Republican side, where it would be possible to not hold elections.
The way it looks right now, Democrats are likely to take the House in November. Nevertheless, the removals or impeachment would require 2/3 of the Senate, which the way it looks right now, and of course there's still a lot could change, but it's rather unlikely that the Democrats take the Senate. So if removal is off the table, impeachment is off the table, does winning the House actually change that much in terms of constraining Donald Trump?
So I would say the Democrats doing well in the midterm elections is a necessary but not sufficient condition. As I said earlier, there is very little that the Democrats institutionally can do in Congress now. And so if they controlled one branch of Congress, it would at least give them a foothold in the legislative process. Now, Congress is not actually passing a lot of legislation right now, certainly not without the president giving them the go-ahead to do it. Trump is doing a lot through executive orders. He doesn't need legislation to act in foreign policy terms, and so it wouldn't change a tremendous amount there. The Republicans in Congress are holding some oversight hearings, and frankly, we are seeing pretty disgraceful behavior by cabinet officials appearing before Congress. I was a congressional staffer on the House for 4 years and certainly never saw members of the administration talk to members of Congress with the degree of disdain and disrespect that we are seeing from cabinet members now. So if the Democrats did control the House, you would probably have a larger number of oversight hearings, you would have a larger number of investigations that would be happening, but I have to assume that members of the administration would continue with their very dismissive behavior that we have seen to date. On the impeachment question, you're right that it is very possible that the House would move on articles of impeachment as it did during Trump's first term. Democrats not only need to win the Senate, but you need to have 2/3, as you said, of senators voting. I don't see any electoral math in which Democrats are going to end up with 67 seats in Congress. Historically, the party in opposition tends to win back Congress in the midterms, at least one House. And the Republicans have a very, very narrow majority in the House right now, which makes it much easier for the Democrats to flip that. Given the states that are up for re-election in the Senate, it is going to be harder for the Democrats to flip the Senate, but it is possible. Even if they do flip the Senate, they are going to be very short of the 67 that would be required for impeachment. And of course, if the Democrats don't take the Senate, they don't have the ability to block the confirmation of judges and ambassadors and other positions that the Republicans controlling the Senate currently have.
So for my last question, I wanted to ask you something that's very close to Poland, which is Article 5. And obviously, Article 5 has been the foundation of European security since 1949. It was always, nevertheless, a political commitment, not an automatic mechanism, depending on the willingness of the strongest ally to show up, which is the United States. And yes, of course, Europe is investing more in its own defense. Poland in particular has great modernization plans and is spending a lot in its own defense. But we know that closing the capability gap that we have with the United States will take at least a decade. So now getting to the question, we sit in Warsaw today. Does the security rest on Article 5 as a binding commitment between allies, or does it depend, can we trust it? Is it still credible, or does it depend on a personal relationship between a bilateral relationship between Poland and the United States?
I think the fact that you are asking that question, that people are asking that question, already reflects a diminution in the deterrent power of NATO and Article 5. For decades, that was simply taken for granted, and it wouldn't even be a question that you would be asking if we did this interview several years ago, several decades ago. And so Trump has called into question, both through his comments, through his actions, U.S. commitment to NATO. And I think that weakens the deterrent value of NATO. As you said, Article 5 always depends on countries reaching a unanimous decision to take action, and each country acting in a way that is within its means within that agreed set of actions. We had statements by President Trump in his first term calling into question whether he would support countries, for example, that had not met their defense spending commitments. He raised questions about Montenegro and small countries and whether he would come to their defense. I feel like he has been slightly less provocative in his comments in this term, calling into question some of those specifics, but some of those same broad principles still remain in place. That said, I think there is still strong bipartisan support for NATO. Marco Rubio was one of those that led efforts to introduce legislation through Trump's first term, requiring congressional authorization before a president could withdraw from the NATO alliance. So I would like to still believe that despite some of Trump's skepticism about the alliance, some of his comments about the alliance, that the United States could still be counted on as a reliable ally and would still come to the defense of its allies. It is not lost on me or many Americans that the only time Article 5 was invoked was following 9/11, when we had Europeans standing by our side. And we have also seen in the last couple of weeks, Trump belatedly recognizing the value of Europe and NATO, that you have very strategically located bases that he wanted to use for the military action in Iran, that Europe has effective militaries that he wants to help open the Strait of Hormuz. And so hopefully these lessons and reminders will not be lost on him, that there is mutual value and benefit to NATO and our alliances generally.
But the European response would probably not contribute to him thinking about the mutual reassurance, right?
Yes, and I think that the administration has drawn a false equivalence between Europe expecting the United States to help on Ukraine and Europe not wanting to help the United States on Iran. Ukraine did not choose to be attacked. Europe's eastern flank did not provoke this situation. This was something that Russia had done to Ukraine, and allies came to the defense of this large country on Europe's eastern flank. The war in Iran is very much seen as a war of choice that Trump did not consult allies about, engage allies about, and then is belatedly trying to involve them in the repercussions of this conflict.
Amanda Sloat, thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us. We invite you to listen to all 5 special episodes of the Polityka Insight podcast recorded at the Warsaw European Conversation 2026.